Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear us okay there? Yes? All right. First of all, I really want to thank Paul. Paul, thank you so much for your generosity, your invitation. You are always as wonderful as you can be, as anyone can be. And I don't know if Danny is here. Where's Danny? Danny, if you're not here, I hope you hear me. Thank you so much. You know, you've been terrific also in making all these arrangements. Thank you so much, Danny. I cannot tell you how pleased I am to have with me here next to me is Ambassador Fred Huff. We go back, I don't know, how many years, Fred? Too many years, he says. Fred has been appointed by President Obama as an ambassador to deal with the Syrian crisis going back now 5, 6 years? Yes. And I don't think there is many people anywhere that really know the Syrian crisis, the Syrian civil war, the tragic situation in Syria better than Fred Huff. So I thought today, instead of just talking about Syria and what's going on inside, we'd rather identify first who are the players in Syria, the main 6 players. And once we identify them and agree that what it is that they wish, what it is that they want, this may give us an opportunity also to look in terms of what solution can be found if we were to consider, of course, the desires, the wishes, the strategic interest and other interests of all the players involved. So I think we can begin by taking, and we haven't even decided who's going to talk about each player. What we're going to speak to about 3-4 minutes about define the players involved, and then we can try to see if we can reconcile what it is that they want to achieve in order to see if there's any horizon, any prospect for peace in Syria anytime soon. So I'm going to start with you, Fred, to take any of the players you wish. And I'll take the next one.
Okay, thank you, Alon, and good morning. Yes, good morning still to one and all. It's a pleasure to be with you. Why don't I start with Russia? This is actually rather complex because it's been my observation down through the years, and I spent a lot of quality time in Moscow in early 2012 and right through with Russian diplomats to Geneva in June 2012. Speaking at length with them about precisely the question, what is it Russia wants out of Syria? The conclusion I come to is that the issue has to be divided really into 2 distinct pieces. First, what is it that President Vladimir Putin wants out of Syria? And second, what is it the Russian Federation wants out of Syria in terms of more conventional Russian interests? I think for Mr. Putin, from the beginning, Syria has been an important facet of him being able to make one central point to his electorate, to his constituency in Russia, and that is that Russia is back as a great power. Pay no attention to a faltering economy. Pay no attention to persistent reports of corruption. We are back after decades of humiliation, and Exhibit A in terms of evidence is the fact that we have rescued Bashar al-Assad from a regime change vendetta being waged by that warmonger, Barack Obama. So I honestly do believe that for Vladimir Putin personally, the domestic political content of what he has been able to do in Syria is of transcendent importance. And this obviously says something about what it will take to settle the Syrian problem so long as he is the president of the Russian Federation. You know, in terms of conventional Russian interests in Syria, what I've been told by very senior people years ago in the foreign ministry, you know, it'll come as no surprise. A preeminent role for Russia in terms of relations with Syria, trade, economics, politics, security assistance, continuation of what amounts to a naval gas station at Tartus, perhaps now the continuation of an air base in Latakia province, and you know where some of the more conventional Arabist, if you will, Russian diplomats take a slightly different approach from the president of the Federation is a view I heard expressed often privately, and that is that you know, we really have no particular affection for Bashar al-Assad, and quite frankly, Russian interests in Syria and in the region would be better served if there were somebody other than Assad in charge of the country. You know, one can hear this in private conversations with Russian diplomats, but that's obviously not Vladimir Putin's take on the situation, and I think we know who's in charge.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take the next player, which is Iran itself. You know, Iran, I believe, since the revolution in 1979, has had always in mind the objective of being the regional hegemon. And their views of that is because they see themselves from a historical perspective. As a matter of fact, they are more Shiite in the Gulf than all the Sunnis combined. I mean, from their perspective, this is like it's a right rather than just an aspiration. They look at their history, 4,000 years of continuing history, very rich culture. The Iraq War, in my view, presented to Iran an incredible historic opportunity, and we know how Iran managed to get into Iraq and it began to exert tremendous influence then and continue to this very day. Iran's ultimate ambition of that is to create, and to a great extent has been able to achieve that, although not totally solidified, a crescent from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. They are in Iraq now. They have tremendous, you know, they utilize, they exploit, I should say, the civil war in Syria itself. They interject themselves into Syria and through Hezbollah into Lebanon. And today, Iran has the tremendous influence over this crescent, and that is part and parcel of their goal of regional hegemony. So when we talk about their role in Syria, in my view, no matter what the United States or Russia or Israel would like to see happen, Iran is going to be part and parcel of any future solution to Syria itself. That is, Israeli may want to push Iran back away from the Israeli borders, perhaps not allow them to establish any military base next to it, and that may very well be arranged with the support of Russia itself. But Iran is going to remain in Syria, perhaps push further north, and that is where Iran is going to be today. So any in search for a solution, and I don't know if Fred will agree with me, that Iran is going to be, has played and will continue to play a significant role in the search for a solution to the Syrian conflict.
I do agree with that, Alon. And before moving on to another party, let me just add something. An observation drawn from 2.5 years worth of Track 2 discussions with very senior Iranian former officials, some of whom very close to the Revolutionary Guards, not the usual collection of Iranians trotted out to deal with the barbarians. The point that was made repeatedly to the Americans during these discussions was don't underestimate how important Bashar al-Assad is personally to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Don't underestimate that at all. And this is where Iranian interests, as defined by the supreme leader and so forth, and even the president of Iran and his foreign minister, converge directly with those of Vladimir Putin. It comes down to something very personal. Bashar al-Assad. Why? Assad has demonstrated over the years his willingness to cooperate very, very closely with Iran, even to the point of subordination, on the issue of supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and providing strategic depth for Hezbollah. For Iran, Hezbollah is the jewel in the crown in its regional policies, and the Iranians have concluded, rightly or wrongly, but I think probably correctly, that within Syria itself there is no constituency for subordinating this country to Iran on questions of Hezbollah except in the ruling family and its entourage. If the Iranians could find somebody willing to continue and sustain the policy, they could certainly be interested in alternatives to Assad. They're no more in love with him on a personal basis than the Russians are. But they have concluded analytically, and I think accurately, that it's Assad or no one in Syria. I honestly think I'm reflecting those discussions accurately. Just a couple of words, perhaps, about the United States, and in some ways, this might be the toughest one to address analytically. I think in terms of an ultimate national security objective for the United States with respect to Syria, it would be something along the lines of a stable, peaceful Syria with legitimate governance, a country generally inclined to cooperate with the United States in the region and beyond. I don't know. I've been out of government for more than 5 years now. I don't know if we're still in the business of trying to articulate national security objectives for specific problems. But if we are, I think the longer-term national security objective would probably be articulated that way. The problems that friends and former colleagues of mine who are in government right now are focused on revolve around what I think is a central fact. And look, I say this in all modesty. I've been involved one way or the other with Syria off and on since I was a 16-year-old American Field Service exchange student in Damascus. There is not a soul, no one, who can say with any degree of reliability or credibility what Syria is going to look like 1, 3, 5, 10, 20 years from now. Nobody. There are so many chefs in the kitchen. There are so many players. Even when we talk about the Assad regime, it's basically at this point a collection of militias. In order to get to this kind of a long-term objective, somehow you've got to stop the bleeding, okay? And one of the things American officials are looking at is the question of what to do about this abominable problem of civilian protection in Syria. Okay, right now the administration has settled on a formula that it is not entirely happy with, and that is the United States will take modest military means, if necessary, to punish the Assad regime for the use of really high potency chemical or biological weapons. But it's got to be high potency. It's got to be something that actually kills people. The dilemma the administration faces, and people understand this, is that in the eyes of somebody who's really cynical and opportunistic, like Bashar al-Assad, this red line against really bad chemical weapons amounts to a green light for everything else. And Assad has even interpreted this as a green light to weaponize chlorine gas. Chemicals themselves account for under 1% of the Syrian civilians who have been slaughtered in this conflict. And what people in the administration are grappling with is the knowledge that this is not only, it's not only a humanitarian catastrophe. There are national security interests involved here. In 2015, Europe, Western Europe, was flooded with refugees, 60% of them Syrians, escaping the country. It's had unbelievable political consequences for the politics of Western Europe, something we're still trying to work through. Syria's neighbors, some of which are allies of the United States, have had to deal with, with very, very heavy refugee flows and all the consequences. So coming to grips, what is it, and in my view, to the credit of this administration, nearly a year ago now, it did respond when the Assad regime used chemical weapons against a town in northern Syria. And lo and behold, we did not end up with World War III or the invasion and occupation of Syria. But this is a problem people in the administration continue to grapple with, along with a different problem: how to stabilize Syria east of the Euphrates River in the wake of the defeat of ISIS. What will that stabilization look like? What will it try to achieve? There are other elements in the American calculation. In southwest Syria, there is a live possibility of clashes between Israel, Hezbollah, and other Iranian militias escalating into something more serious, something that could ultimately bring Israel and Lebanon back into another cycle like 2006.
Yeah, I just want to mention a couple of points in connection with the United States. Going back to the Obama administration, as many of you, all of you remember the so-called red line. Then when Syria at the time used chemical weapons, and actually President Obama did nothing about it. He settled for removing the chemical weapons from Syria. But since then, there is no American policy, a strategy as to how to deal with Syria. And I think this has been a major contributor to the ongoing, the continuing civil war in there. But I also, Fred mentioned something that I just wanted to have quickly a picture of what's going on there in terms of who are the other players. And I think in those terms, first of all, we haven't mentioned Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a specific interest in Syria because Syria is a Sunni majority, and they want to have a say as far as that's going to go. So you have Iraq as a player as well because of what's going on in Syria and this bordering Syria. Turkey has an interest in Syria because of the Kurdish problem that you have there. We mentioned Hezbollah for that matter. Then you have, I would say, 20, 30 different jihadist groups, some of them between 50 to 60, some of them several hundred, still in Syria fighting, not under the banner of ISIS, but they're still there. Then you have the rebels to deal with. So when you look at this plethora of states as well as the groups, and you start to think in terms of what sort of solution you're going to be able to fashion in order to work this and to satisfy the needs, the requirements of all of these players. Fred is absolutely correct. We cannot see this kind of solution because the three elements I think that we have to focus on. One, we are going to need, whether the United States likes it or not, United States ought to be involved in the search for a solution. And whether we like the Russian or not, Russia is indispensable a player, and nothing will happen in Syria if Russia is not going to be, basically Russia is going to run the show. So the United States ought to be finding somewhere along the line a ways by which to work with Russia. Iran is indispensable, is going to be as well there. Of course, the Bashar regime, Assad himself. So when we look at the whole picture of Syria today, each of these elements, plus Hezbollah, plus other players, have a certain stake in the search for a solution itself. And we don't see that. I mean, I don't see that happening anytime soon. The question that I'd like to discuss now with Fred is, what's going to take? That is, what are the basic minimal requirement of each player? In which area they'll be prepared to give in or to give up a little bit in order potentially to establish some kind of a ceasefire, sustainable one, in order to be able to reach an agreement and end this horrifying tragedy, the likes of which we haven't seen since World War II.
That's an excellent question, Alon, and it kind of leads into the subject of what are the interests of Bashar al-Assad and his regime, because it is simply one of survival. That comes as no surprise. I don't come at this from a particularly ideological point of view. My main job, I was asked to come back in government in '09, right after the inauguration of President Obama by Senator George Mitchell, with whom I'd had a long-standing relationship. He asked me to take the lead in trying to put together a treaty of peace between Israel and Syria. And that's what I was involved in when the shooting started in Syria. I had several meetings with Bashar al-Assad. I found him to be quite businesslike. But when he decided to use lethal force against people who were peacefully protesting police brutality, and when he decided to persist in that, we came to the conclusion, the Israelis came to the conclusion, this guy's got a fundamental legitimacy problem, and there's just no way peace talks can be resumed. I think if you look at the key players here, what Russia, Iran, and Assad himself have in common is a bottom line interest in perpetuating the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It is conceivable, I guess, as things are evolving, that Turkey might be able to find itself at peace with that result, provided it gets what it wants with respect to Syrian Kurds. This is a notable evolution because President Erdogan had invested many years of work in cultivating Syria and cultivating the Assad family personally, and his view was that the way the Assad regime handled the uprising in Syria was a personal betrayal of him. He took it very personally, and I suspect he still does. But as a practical matter, I guess if he can get his way on the Kurdish issue, he could see his way clear to keeping Assad in power. For the United States, it's problematical. There is no violent regime change program ongoing. I think I think the main American concern, what I hear from people in government, and it's a view I happen to agree with, is that Assad's methodology for staying in power, a methodology based on collective punishment and mass civilian homicide, is something that recruits for extremists around the world, not just in Syria. So I think for the United States, his continued role in Syria is problematical. But seeing something as problematical is not the same thing as having the leverage to produce a different result. Our session is entitled "The Dilemmas of Syria," and I think this is one of the dilemmas for the United States. Just where, if anywhere, do we want to draw a line? What kind of resources are we willing to put into this? Even when I think, as a former Army officer who's acquainted with civil military operations, civil affairs, this can be rather labor-intensive stuff. If we're going to stabilize eastern Syria, where are the warm bodies going to come from? It's difficult enough for a Department of State that's been under some pressure, to say the least, personnel-wise. It's not all that easy for the 1% of our countrymen and their families who serve in uniform to take on yet another mission. So I think the issue of resources will be very important. And I would just say, just as a follow-on to my earlier statement about no one knows where Syria is going to be 1, 3, 5, 10, 20 years from now. I think what I'd be willing to say, something I truly believe in, is that nothing good is going to happen in Syria if civilians remain on the bullseye as this dispute continues. And to me, this is just politics 101. If we want people to sit down in Geneva or some other venue and talk about political compromise, exhibit flexibility, exhibit good manners, it seems to me that's very difficult to produce if the constituents of one party are being vaporized by the other.
Let me just add one thing about the United States and Syria. I mean, when this conflict began, the United States took the position, specifically during the Obama administration, that Bashar Assad cannot be part of the solution. And this view has been held now for a number of years. I believe, and I don't know if Fred agrees with me, that today the Trump administration accepts the fact that under certain circumstances, Bashar Assad is going to have to be part of the solution. And that is, as long as Russia and Iran need Assad to be there, they are not going to abandon Assad in order for them to maintain their presence in Syria itself. There's one other point I want to mention in relation to the state of Israel. You talk to the many Israelis, they would tell you today Israel has always preferred Assad. That is, for the Israelis, Assad was a stable, that is his father including. Going back to the 1974 disengagement agreement, the Syrian regime did not violate that agreement not once. Am I right? Not once. I personally have been very much involved in the various negotiations. I can tell you that during the last 12 years, Syria made at least 4 different overtures toward Israel, seeking peace with Israel. And I was in Damascus, and I'm sure Fred knows the situation there just better than I do. But I can tell you that from the time we arranged the meeting between asked Turkey to become the mediator. By the request came to me through Walid Muallim at the time. Assad was absolutely ready, willing, and able to, and wanted badly to make peace with Israel. Today, when you speak to the Israelis, they will still tell you they will be happy to see Bashar Assad remain in power. Do you agree with that? Let's go ahead.
I hear different stories from different Israelis. I think certainly when Bashar's dad, Hafiz al-Assad, was running the show, the Israelis were not exactly having a love affair with him, but they saw him as a reasonably sober and reliable interlocutor. I don't think, in fact, I know they do not regard Bashar al-Assad in the same light. They see Bashar al-Assad as accepting subordination to Iran on key questions, and they also see Bashar al-Assad accepting basically peer status with Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. Now, I imagine Bashar al-Assad sees things differently. He probably believes he can play off the various parties that are supporting him. Talking to people in the Department of Defense and elsewhere, people who try to keep a close watch on this, however, one fact, one sort of order of battle fact emerges, and that is the Syrian Arab Army, the official army of Syria, the army of the regime, is broken. It just has a handful of units that are capable of sustained fire and maneuver. Assad is reliant on tens of thousands of militiamen assembled by Iran, Shia militiamen from various places. Probably the most proficient of them are Hezbollah from Lebanon. There are others from Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So his reliance on Iran is pretty substantial. I would argue, in that sense, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, from everything you see in the papers about this, I would argue that Iran has considerably more leverage on Bashar al-Assad than Russia does. The Bashar al-Assad I know is quite capable of concluding that Vladimir Putin needs him more than vice versa. Okay, whether that is factually true or not is debatable. But again, going back to my discussions with Russian diplomats, I remember one in particular in Moscow, where we were discussing at the time ways and means of getting the Assad regime actually to implement steps it had agreed to with Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary General, who at the time was the special envoy in Syria, and these were discussions in Moscow, what Russia might do to oblige its client to play ball with Kofi Annan, who was desperately trying to de-escalate this situation. This was in early 2012. And one very senior Russian diplomat said, he shook his head and he said, Fred, you just got to understand, we don't have that kind of leverage. For decades now, the Assad family has perfected the technique of taking from us with two hands and not even muttering the words, thank you, as they show us to the door. It's not as easy as you think. I heard that from number of Russian diplomats. It could all be a game. It could all be an excuse. But I suspect there's something to it. And in my discussions now with friends and former colleagues who are in government, I try to suggest, let's figure out ways to put this to a test. Just how, if we're gonna try to go on a long patrol with the Russians in Syria, let's at least have a good idea of what it is they're able to deliver, if in the first place they're inclined to deliver. There was one test case not long ago when the Russians went to the Syrian opposition representatives at Geneva, the team of people who is responsible for working with UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura on negotiations. The Russians went to them and said, we're going to be having a big conference in Sochi. Would you guys be willing to attend? And the response was, yes, we would, but there's one condition. You've got to convince Assad to take a pause, to take an extended timeout in the civilian bombing, because we too have constituents, and if we show up in Sochi and the bombing continues, it's not going to be good for us. And initially the Russians said, fine, we'll work on that. They ultimately did not deliver, and this delegation did not go to Sochi. Did they decide they didn't want to deliver, or were they unable to deliver? I guess that's the question.
Well, maybe we'll have a little discussion, a few minutes, just before we take some questions. And that is, we sort of tried to describe, define the main players and what it is that they aspire for, what it is that they want to. Now, given what we know now, we know what Iran would like to see happen, what Russia would like to see take place, what Bashar Assad, we see himself 5, 6, 10 years down the line. Where do we go from here in terms of beginning at least to see some path that they can pursue in order to reach some sort of an agreement? And if we can begin to define, just as briefly as we can, what it is, for example, the Russian will settle for with the least, what the least with the Iranians settle for, what the Bashar Assad will settle for. And perhaps we can create some kind of a framework. I know we cannot do that in 10, 15 minutes, but let's just give it a little try.
Well, there are.
Let's take one play at a time.
There are some proposals on the table, some of which have actually inspired some interest within the U.S. government. What the Russians have proposed and what the UN Special Envoy is supporting is an extended series of discussions aimed at amending the Syrian constitution and laying the groundwork for general elections, perhaps as early as 2021 or something like that.
But you know, Fred, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We go back exactly to the same old, I would dare say, bankrupt policy of the United States and other Western power things in terms of let's have an election, let's see, and needless to say, if you're going to have an election, Bashar Assad is going to be elected. We know that just like what happened in Russia. Well, I'm thinking in terms of if it's a search for a solution, we're going to need something a little bit more that consider very carefully what's actually happened now in Syria. Syria is basically laying ruin. Millions are refugees, millions are internally displaced, more than 500,000 are dead. So to suggest, in my view, having just an election and really have a new government, that's not going to go anywhere. And moreover, it's going to be very, very difficult to implement. Whereas, in my view, if you have these main players to agree on something different in terms of, which I talked about, I talk about it when it comes to any conflict resolution has been intractable for years, and that is you're going to need a transitional period with the objective, specific objective in mind. Without transitional period, before you go into an election, all the players can have a role to play in this, during this transitional period, so that you can begin to cement some kind of civility, stability, and end to the violence as a prerequisite to having an election and electing a new government, which is not going to go anywhere, but it's going to be no different than the current the Bashar government.
Yeah, I wasn't issuing an endorsement. Actually, I was just trying to describe what's out there, what's in play right now diplomatically. I think clearly for any kind of for any kind of discussions about the shape of a constitution or the holding of national elections in a place that is just steaming with wreckage and violence, there has to be a stop to the violence first. I mean, this is just inescapable. I know of no one in the United States who is counseling the invasion and occupation of Syria or the violent overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. But what the Trump administration discovered last year when it responded very quickly to sarin nerve agent attacks was that this does tend to slow down the pace of mass murder. Even President Obama, when he was in the process of ultimately allowing his red line to be erased, did notice that for while it actually looked like the United States was going to give someone a punch in the nose, the violence subsided greatly. It was only when the chemical weapons removal agreement was signed and Assad realized, whoa, I'm off the hook. As long as I don't use sarin, I can throw the kitchen sink at civilians. That's when things got really out of hand. And if you take a look historically at the second half of the last quarter of 2013, with John Kerry racing around trying to convene a Geneva conference while all hell was breaking loose, courtesy of the Syrian Air Force, you can see it's a pretty good case study of why these sort of elaborate negotiating strategies don't work, cannot work, as long as civilians are on the bullseye. I mean, we do have some real dilemmas here. I do not think there is any inclination, and I'm not saying 5%, I'm saying 0. There is no inclination on the part of Bashar al-Assad, his family, and his entourage to share power with anyone. Assad sees the sharing of power as the slippery slope to the yielding of power, and therefore a fast track to The Hague or some other place where he would be held accountable for everything that's been documented over the past 7 years. For Bashar al-Assad, you either stay in the saddle or you're dead.
But he is at the mercy of Iran and Russia. That is, I do not believe that he can stay one day in power if these two powers support him, continue to support him. Do you agree? So which
I
means,
agree, but it's a big if. I am not. This is where my classic American normal optimism kind of breaks down. I am just not seeing anything under current conditions where the Iranians would be willing to give up Bashar personally or where Vladimir Putin would.
That's exactly my point. They are not willing to give him up, and he depending on them as well. So it is a mutual dependence on one another for them to survive. That's how we see it. I think you see it that same way. So which means, whether he wants to share power or not share power, it's really not quite up to him anymore, because he needs the continuing support of these two powers, Iran and Russia. Now, these are the three main players. Can we, in fact, move forward without some kind of involvement of the United States?
Probably not, and that leads me to what I suspect should be my final point before we open it up. I mentioned earlier that the stabilization of eastern Syria, this is Syria east of the Euphrates River, where the United States, leading a coalition with a predominantly Kurdish ground force, has just about finished militarily with ISIS. There is some thought in the administration to trying to use the process of stabilization to encourage, facilitate a potential governance alternative to Assad in eastern Syria. We're not talking here about the partition of the country, but there is some thought given to allowing, some combination, local Kurds, local Arabs, Syrian opposition, coming together, melding together the local councils in this area, and having some kind of an umbrella governance system that could offer to the people of Syria something that even the strongest supporters of Bashar al-Assad, who happen to be some of my best Syrian friends, have been begging for years. They've said, this is even supporters. Alon, they said, okay, we accept that the regime is brutal, the regime is corrupt. We've been living with this for years and years and years, but for the love of God, show us the alternative. Okay, and this is something that has not been produced over the years. So there is some thought now to using eastern Syria, using the stabilization that is really an obligation to allow the alternative to emerge. I think that, combined with the issue of civilian protection and what do we do? What do we do to avoid giving Assad an accidental green light to do what he wants to civilians, as long as he doesn't do it with sarin nerve agent? What do we do about that? These are the two elements of strategy that are under active discussion right now. Whether that discussion continues with a new national security advisor moving in on the 9th of April, I do not know. I mentioned to Alon earlier, I was not aware of any particular statements that Mr. Bolton has made down the years about the nature of the internal conflict in Syria or anything. I looked for it this morning, and I really couldn't find any. I've seen statements about the danger that Syria poses, historically, to the security of Israel. I've heard Syria mentioned by him in the context of Iran, but nothing about the nature of the uprising that began in March 2011 and its national security consequences for the United States. So this is a big question.
And just one more point, and then we're going to take some questions, and that is, any political solution, in my view, however it's reached, and the role of each player that can be fashioned and defined, there is a big problem, of course, of reconstruction. In my view, and I think you agree, Fred, that any political solution that does not have major economic development that go hand in hand with it, it may not last. And we're talking about economic development in terms of what Syria needs today. Some people estimate in the excess of at least 100 to $250 billion to seriously begin any process of reconstruction, without which I'm not sure any kind of political solution can be sustained.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I know that one of the Russian objectives in all of this, and the Kremlin's not been all that shy about articulating it, is that Western Europe should pay for the reconstruction of Syria, and it should take place under the auspices of Bashar al-Assad. And if we're talking about $200, $300 billion worth of goods and services, how much of that under current management would actually get down to the people who needs it is I think, a central question.
All right, well, thank you so much, Fred. We'll take some questions for the time available. Any questions?
You mentioned earlier that issue, the dilemma that we have with alternatives to Assad. And I think Alon, you've mentioned earlier also that the Israelis may be comfortable to some extent with Assad. And I'm thinking of this in the larger context of the Middle East and what's happened in Egypt, with their attempt with the Arab Spring and, some of the other countries as well. I mean, isn't the fact, or isn't there truth to this, consternation existing, whether with some supporters of Assad or, some of the other powers, that there's a concern that if there's a democratic process in the Middle East, it'll bring to power, a more Islamic-leaning, leader that may not be as friendly to the interests of either Israel or to the West?
I think your name was mentioned.
Well, you're both.
I have some sort of aversion when you speak about democratic process to be introduced. We know what happened in Egypt. We know what tried to happen in Libya. And that is the mistake we in the West make time and again and again. Let me again repeat, there is no tradition. I'm not suggesting that the Arab world doesn't want to be free and that and the young men and women do not want to have a freedom of speech and they want to have job and everything else. But after the revolution in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, and there was an election, people woke up in the morning and said, now we are free. We can say whatever we want, but where is the food? Where are the opportunities? What's the future foretell for us? That is the problem. That's why, in my view, about dealing with conflict resolution, to me, in situations like this, where there was no tradition of democratic form of government, where poverty is rampant, take Egypt with 40 million under the poverty line, when 30% of young men and women have no jobs, to say to them, okay, you have a democratic form of government, that is not going to provide the answer that these young men and women, millions of them, who are looking for. They want opportunities first. If you provide opportunities, job, education, healthcare, all of that, that is for them is a prerequisite. Then you want to go to the democratic, election, all of that. When you do not have democratic institution to support the political democracy, is not going to happen, which means we're going to need to have a transitional period, in my view, 5, 10, 7 years, provided you have a government that is going to be committed to the need of the people and move on without, while not engaging in terrible human rights abuses. That is the problem we have today. You have it in Egypt, you have it just about everywhere, and you're going to have it in Syria as well. That's why I do not think the solution to Syria is an election, but it's going to have to be a consensus building first between the various factions and states in Syria, so that they will get some kind of an understanding, where do we go from here? provided many of them need, we have to meet some of their needs and some requirements, be that the states as well as the various groupings.
But who needs that transitional government, though? Because if it's not organic,
Well, it is not. I mean, let's say, if Fred and I are going to go to Syria tomorrow and try to find a solution, what do? We're going to have to deal with all these major players and say to them, do you want to enter the civil war? They're going to say, yes, we want to enter the civil war. Okay, what do you want? And each is going to say, that's what I want. The problem we have is what they want, what they wish, it's very difficult today to reconcile. That is the problem. There is no process of reconciliation. And you need a commitment to reconcile, and that commitment doesn't exist either.
There was actually a methodology agreed on in Geneva in June 2012 by the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. This was, for all intents and purposes, this was my last act as a U.S. government official, June 2012. And it was interesting. I did not think until the very last minute that an agreement was going to be reached, all right? Because what was on the table in terms of a final text was a formula for systematic, peaceful regime change in Syria. I was stunned that the Russians signed up to this. And as it turned out, the Russians realized shortly thereafter what a mistake they had made. And they have been backing away from the Geneva final communique ever since. And I'll just give you a sense of how it would have worked. When we were negotiating with the Russians, and the Chinese were there basically to support the Russians, my French and British colleagues and I started out with the position for an interim government. Bashar al-Assad and his entourage have to be eliminated. We cannot have them, as given their record, cannot have them as part of any kind of interim arrangement for Syria. The Russians said, no, absolutely not. We will not accept that. So we spoke for a few hours. We came up with an alternative. We said, okay, how about if we simply say in the final communique, people with blood on their hands, okay? Assad's obviously not the only person with blood on his hands. People with blood on their hands cannot participate. And the Russian delegate looked at me and he said, Fred, that's not going to work. Everybody's going to know you're talking about Assad. And I said, Vitaly, you got me there. Okay, so what we eventually agreed to was negotiations between the opposition and the regime under international auspices that would produce, on the basis of mutual consent, meaning a mutual veto, a transitional governing body that would run Syria for an indefinite period of time. If the opposition wanted to accept Bashar al-Assad or his brother or his cousin or anybody as part of the transitional governing body, it was free to do so, but there was mutual veto. Russia signed up to this. I mean, if anybody is interested, it was eventually blessed by the UN Security Council, but there is a methodology out there. Russia is in the position now of absolutely rejecting what it signed up to on the 30th of June, 2012.
Any other questions? Please.
The Syrian situation is very complicated, and you understand that in the way you are talking about. I mean, talking politics, moving from Geneva 1 to Geneva 2 to Geneva 3 and Geneva 4, the politicians failed real thing, which Ambassador suggested regarding setting up a model the eastern part of the Euphrates. But Turkey has already destroyed, the model which they had established in eastern Euphrates in Afrin. Afrin is supposed to have been one of those models, self-governing councils. And now Turkey is threatening U.S. to move into Manbij and move all the way to Deir ez-Zor. Would the U.S. venture to stop Turkey venturing into those areas?
Thank you very much for your comment. Again, the title of the session here is Dilemmas, Syrian Dilemmas, plural, and this is a big one. This is a big one for the United States. I would say that in the near term, and this is something that our Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, is personally involved in the near term, the hardest and heaviest diplomatic lift we face is trying to square the circle of Turkey as a NATO ally and its interests, and Syrian Kurds with whom we have worked for over 3 years to defeat ISIS. Is it impossible? Is it a bridge too far? I don't know. If we don't try, we're not doing our jobs. I am no more enamored than you are, sir, of some actions that Turkey has taken, and yet I'm inclined to believe, as just a baseline fact of life, that the stabilization of Syria east of the Euphrates, which is going to be an American-led effort, is going to get nowhere without some measure of Turkish cooperation, acquiescence. At the same time, we absolutely, in my view, cannot abandon the people we've been working with for the past nearly 3.5 years. Now, in some respects, our government has tried to divide the baby here by saying that the Afrin district has absolutely nothing to do with the fight against ISIS. So our partners here east of the Euphrates are not necessarily engaged in the same activities up in Afrin, but the practical problem is the fighting in Afrin has drawn some of these forces from the mopping up campaign against ISIS out to the northwestern part of Syria. So again, an incredibly heavy diplomatic lift in the end, and I spoke with a prominent advisor to President Erdogan the other day, and this was my basic question. Will President Erdogan be able to say yes if he is presented with something that could lower the pressure on Syrian Kurds and enable the stabilization of eastern Syria to move forward? I was told, oh, of course he'll say yes. I'm not, given his own domestic political priorities, and it all comes back to the age-old saying about all politics being local. Given President Erdogan's domestic political priorities, I don't know how far he would be willing to go in this direction.